Welcome to another program at the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum. Tonight is another program in our series, Monday Night Philosophy, which has been going on for a couple decades now here. What I'm going to talk about tonight is against the sort of general trend of our society, the zeitgeist. Free will is considered passé. We don't really do it, don't use it. I mean, a lot of people say that they think that they've got free will, but when it comes to scientific knowledge and general scientific attitudes, a lot of people don't believe that there's actual free will. And I'm going to talk about why that is and why the logic that's being used is insufficient to come to that conclusion, among other things. So, what is free will? First of all, I'm not talking about moral responsibility. A big part of the free will argument for the last couple thousand years has been we have to have free will because that makes us morally responsible for our actions, and therefore we can be punished, which is why animals don't have free will or have only instinct, and we don't have to worry about them because they're not ever going to be saved and they're never going to be punished. So whatever they do is okay, but whatever we do isn't because of that thing. Now, that's a very interesting set of arguments, and it's certainly a big part of the arguments about free will. And I'm sorry, I'm setting all those aside because it's not really part of the way I look at it. What I mean by free will is not the decision that makes you morally responsible to some divine being or anybody else or the universe, however you want to look at it. What I mean is that do you make decisions? Do you freely make decisions? Not freely in the sense that you can do whatever you want to and make any decision you want to and have no influences on your decisions. That's obviously not true. People are very influenced by how they make their decisions and how everybody around them is making their decisions, or there would be no fashion if we didn't have something like that. We're certainly influenced by what everybody else is doing. So that's not what I mean either. I just mean, do we make decisions? And I don't draw a line between human beings and other minds, animals. I don't really know where to draw the line as to who makes decisions and who doesn't, but I think it's pretty clear that the line is drawn somewhere between ants and plants, because ants clearly make decisions. You can watch them. They're running around, look like they're running around with their heads chopped off sometimes, but they're running around doing things, and then they do this, and then they do that, and then they look the other way, and then and then they go and do something. So it's very clear that they're making what we would call decisions. Not that they have any moral responsibility for them. As I said, that's not part of the argument here. Now, plants, there are people who argue that plants make decisions, but I at least have never seen a plant, wake up one morning and say, I'm not going to aim my leaves at the sun today. So there might be some kind of ability to make biological plants that don't make any decisions but are very effectively set up to look for water with their roots, look for things, and maybe they do make decisions. I don't know. We probably will never know that. But it really doesn't make a difference where you draw the line. As long as it's between ants and plants or on the other side of plants, there's quadrillions of minds on this planet that are making decisions. So that's what I'm talking about. Do we rely on reason? That's the real crucial thing. And when you rely on reason, basically what you're saying is you don't rely on the theories that reason has brought you to rely on. As soon as you rely on reason itself, rather than the theories, then if somebody gives you better reasons, you begin to rely on that. You change your mind. And I'll show you a chart a little bit later about how that influences change in the way that people think about things. But that's the purely scientific attitude, is to rely on reason, rely on logical argumentation and reliable evidence, but don't think that anything is proven so that you're open to the next better argument at all times. That's the purely scientific attitude, which almost nobody lives by. Because it's not easy. Most people have some of that, most scientists have some of that, but also have all kinds of other things in their mind. And I want everybody, one of the things that I think is important is for everybody to just get comfortable and say, whatever amount of reason I use, that's good enough because that's what I do, and how much I rely on it or don't rely on it, you're not going to change all that much in the way that you do it unless you adopt this attitude that if you hear a better reason, then you go for it. Now, there's not too many people that will do that. Even people who are willing to do that are willing to bypass that if, for example, their job is on the line. You know, if you're working for Henry VIII, and Henry VIII says, I want to be the head of the church instead of the Pope, and your job relies on the fact that you have to agree with Henry VIII, then even if you know he's just lying, and that all he really wants is for a male heir to come about, and so he's got to do things differently than the Pope told him, and so he's got this whole theory about he should be head of the church instead. You know that that's all a lie, but you still go along with it anyway. Now, I'm not trying to draw any analogy to current times, but you know, if your job depends upon it, you're going to go along with this anyway. So, reliable logic. I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Reliable logic is logic where there's no internal inconsistencies or external inconsistencies. That is, the assumptions that you use don't violate each other, don't go against each other, and their application to the outside world, there's no inconsistency with reality, with physical reality or what really happens in people's lives. And I'm going to bring that up a little bit later because I think a lot of the arguments that are used in favor of determinism today by scientists actually has internal inconsistencies in the logic that they use. So that's one of the reasons I don't find it persuasive. So that's sort of the situation. It's important that you kind of divide which logical arguments and which almost logical arguments you can rely upon and not rely upon when you're sorting through things like this. So one thing, for example, you often hear is there is no such thing as a square circle. And people argue, no, there should be able to be a square circle and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a big argument about this. But it's really, really easy to rely on that argument because you've got basic assumptions. You have basic definitions in mathematics. That's why some mathematic arguments are the strongest arguments that we have that we can rely on. In this case, the definition of a circle is a series of points that are equidistant from a fixed point. Okay? And the definition of a square is 4 equal sides joined by right triangles, now right angles by 90 degrees. You can't have both of those things true at the same time. Now, some people say, well, you can have a kind of squarish, circlish kind of object, you know, some rounded edges and stuff like that. But a squarish, circulish object is not a square circle. It's neither a square nor a circle. So it doesn't really work. So theoretically, it is actually inconceivable to imagine a square circle. It's inconceivable. Square circles are inconceivable. Now, I know what I mean when I say the word inconceivable. It's not like Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride saying to the guy played by Wallace Shawn, saying, you keep using that word. I don't think you really know what it means. No, inconceivable really means that you cannot imagine it. And I think there are a lot of things that we do accept that we really can't imagine. And the reason when you have a hard time imagining it is that you don't know what the internal inconsistencies are. Okay? And once you know the internal inconsistency in the definitions of a square and a circle, you know perfectly, okay, this is inconceivable. Now that's conceptual inconceivable things. Now there are practical ones. Let's talk about werewolves. So werewolves are not inconceivable from an imaginary point of view. Werewolves aren't that much different than wolves, so biologically it's possible you could have a werewolf. But and in our dreams we imagine them, and in our movies we can make them, so we can put a face on it and make it happen and everything. But what we know from biology is that animal forms do not change within a few minutes. from one form to another like that. Now, we know that there are butterflies and that they have changed from caterpillars, but they take their time and they're very small and they look a lot like they used to, except for they have wings now. So we can look at that. And so those are like practical inconceivabilities. As long as we have biology, we know that werewolves don't really exist the way we imagine them. Now, if you could show that a wolf, and why also do we think that werewolves exist? Why is the belief so strong? Well, because there's a certain amount of toxic male behavior that happens at full moons that, just makes everybody think that maybe there are werewolves, or that this is the way we explain what happened to those poor guys. But that's, that just adds to our ability to overlook the fact that practically it's inconceivable for a human being to turn into a werewolf, while the full moon is still there. By the time that you could actually maybe turn it in, there would be the next full moon already. So that's what I mean by a practical inconceivability. Now, there's another practical inconceivability, and that is that all philosophers and scientists would all agree on the same answer to every question that's been asked. So I thought I would show you a little bit about this. There's some a study done by two men, Bourget and Chabot, I think his name is. They did a study both in 2009 and they followed it up in 2020. And they're relatively famous surveys of philosophers. In the first one, they had 931 some people, and in the next one they had 2,000. The first one in 2009, they asked 30 questions. Second one, they asked 100 questions. But they asked all these guys a series of questions about what they believed about different objects, of different theories, which theories appealed to them, et cetera, and which ones did they go with. A lot of them were teaching at universities, and what they don't really emphasize was a lot of them did not answer the questions. They didn't send in. But for the 2,000 out of the 2,000, maybe 600 did, and some of them answered 50 of the questions, then gave up. So they had a little explanation. We counted everyone that answered 50 of the 100 questions as having completed the survey, which I thought, as a lawyer, a very interesting way to redefine something. And then between 51 and 99, that was a next set, and then all 100 questions were answered. Only 200 people, so like 10% answered all the questions. But on the free will issue, which is many of the different ones that they had, 11% of those people thought there was no such thing as free will. 19% thought something called libertarianism, which is that having free will is incompatible with determinism. And the other 59% had one version or another of a compatibility argument. The compatibility arguments in modern philosophy about free will are that some kind of free will of some kind or another is compatible with a deterministic universe. So you're saying these people are all making things up. So again, I use these examples so that you can all feel, if they can all make it up, I can make it up too. You can decide whatever you want to about determinism and free will and feel comfortable. But I thought to myself, should I show these charts? Because the charts are very complicated and the typeset is very small, and so you're not going to be able to see it very well. So I thought, maybe I won't show it. And then I thought, no, but it'll make a good point, so maybe I should show it anyway. And then I thought, yeah, but still the whole audience will be bored maybe for a couple minutes, so maybe I shouldn't. And then I thought, why not? Go ahead, put the charts up. Now, before I go any further, I want to take a survey. How many of you feel that the initial conditions of the universe, or an omniscient God, was responsible for my indecisiveness about deciding whether to put the chart up or not? Or was it actually me just being a showman about free will? Okay? So this is just a chart of all the different things. And what I found interesting about this is institutional changes and personal changes. The same people over this 2009 to 2020. See, institutional changes means that institutions, the different universities where the professors taught, did not change their point of view at all over that 11-year period, even though different people were now there, which shows that institutions hire people of the same ilk. Yeah? And personal swing, There's some people that change, but not all that much. The only changes in the whole chart are these little lines here. Not a whole lot, right? Not much change. Most people, and there's all different forms of philosophy. So that's enough of that one. Next one. Oh, I'm going to do that. Okay. And here's the chart you can actually read. And the only interesting thing about this, these are the factors that they found correlated with the most change, causing the most change. You see, there's not much change. The most change was 12%. So most people stayed the same over those 11 years. This factor was a scientific attitude, and this one was a science-friendly attitude. And as I said, if you really are truly scientific, you just wait for better reasons, and then you change your mind. And so those are the factors which caused the most change, is if they had that as part of the way they looked at things. So that I found interesting, because it demonstrates that although we almost never change our mind, that does contribute to our ability to do so. And here is just another chart of all the different ways of looking at the world spread out. And there's another one right after this, which I like even more, which is something called hierarchical structuring. And what they did was they took all these ideas and they said, which ideas go together the most often among the people? Because they had 100 questions to answer. So which of those people that answered this question also answered this question this way? And this is that chart. I could not put it in the other way. I won't make you read it, but it just shows, that a bureaucracy and a philosophy department are very similar. I mean, because that just looked like any old bureaucratic organizational chart to me. So here is an interesting point. So this is a study later. It was in the Trends in Cognitive Sciences magazine. And what they showed was our people, there's a famous experiment, which I'll talk about in a second, called the Libet experiment in 1983, which had people, which they said proved we don't have free will, or at least didn't prove, but leaned in that direction, because we actually had brainwave function going before we made our decision to do something. And therefore, the brainwave function preceded what we did. Therefore, we must not have free will over what we're doing, because that happened first. I have a lot of arguments about that. But this is how people feel about it. People are conscious of executing their decisions. Everybody is on yes. Conscious of the activity of choosing or deciding. So some people are a little bit uncertain about that, but everybody knows that they executed the decision in their own minds. A few people are a little uncertain that they ever noticed that they took a process that led there. Conscious while making the choice, 100% of the people also. What people were not aware of is really quite interesting. One, are they conscious of the external events affecting their decisions? So are they conscious of their environment? Are they conscious of this? A lot of people are, but quite a few people aren't. Now here's another group. Are you conscious of the internal events? What's going on in your mind that affected you? So your internal culture, the internal evidence, a lot fewer people are aware of that. Are you conscious of the relationship between A and B? That is, are you conscious of the things that went on inside your head with your decision to make that thing? And here it's almost all no. People are not aware of that internal connection. So that's the way most people live life. And with that kind of an experience, of course, you're not going to necessarily think you have free will, or you could be talked into it because you're only aware of parts of it. But your experience is that you feel you have free will. Now, you feel you have free will. That's the way most people feel about it. All right. That's enough of the charts. So we have this issue about, do we make our own decisions or not? And as I said, we feel that we do, but how much evidence is there that we actually make decisions? And how much evidence is there in favor of the alternative argument that everything is determined? Well, the deterministic argument in science is one. It's usually based upon initial conditions. You say, if we knew the initial conditions of the universe, then you would be able to predict everything from that point on. And therefore, there's no room for us making individual decisions or changing things at all. That's the basic argument. There's a lot more subtlety to it. I'm not going to try to really review all the details, but I'm going to just talk about the big issues. Now, there's a lot of issues about that, and one of the things is I think in the logic, which is internally inconsistent, is that you make the assumption that after the initial conditions, there's no other causes. There's no other independent causes. Therefore, there's some cause at the beginning, and that everything after that goes back to that cause. That sounds just like Aristotle, in the first cause argument. And so the question is that a reasonable argument to keep? I think not. If you think about what's going on, we really don't know what the initial conditions are. So let's do a thought experiment. Let's say that our observational abilities got much better than they are. Let me also say that I'm totally in favor of the scientific approach to what we're doing, and absolutely amazing what we've done in the last 400 years. So this I don't have any argument with at all. I just want to keep improving what everybody does in their logic and using the logic to really come to conclusions for us. So if we improved, say, in the next 1,000 years or something, we could actually go back to the beginning of the universe according to what we think now and get to the initial conditions, and then having walked all the way back there, walk our way all the way back, having deduced all of the physical laws, because however good we are now, we probably are missing something. One of my analogies is that even if you watched, how many baseball games would it take for you to watch before you knew all the rules of baseball if you didn't know the rules in advance? It would take a long time. You'd have to watch a lot of games. And most likely at the end of 5,000 games, you might have a pretty good idea. But I'd be very surprised if you'd figured out the infield fly rule, right? Because it happens so rarely that even if you'd seen it 3 times, you would not, without knowing what it was, you would not have been able to figure out that there is this one little thing over to the side, right? So I think we're doing really well, but let's just say now we've got all the rules, and we're back to the initial conditions, and then we, based on that theory, we move forward and actually could replicate every single thing that happened for the last 14 billion years and got up to our front, and then predicted the next 200 years based upon that. That's basically what people are saying about this initial conditions deterministic argument, right? So does that sound reasonable at all? First, could we ever do it? I know why we want to do it, but could we ever do it? Could we ever do it? No, we can't. Let's, a much smaller experiment. Let's take a totally still 10-gallon jug of water and then drop one molecule, H2O molecule, into that still water and see exactly what happens. Well, first of all, we know that even if it looks like it's totally still water, it's not still water. The molecules are all bouncing around in there. And even if it was ice, there's still stuff bouncing around in there. And so, and we don't know enough about fluid dynamics yet to be able to predict even that. What would happen with just one molecule of water going into an almost still tub of water? Because it's too complicated for us to calculate. And this other experiment about the whole universe, you would need a computer bigger than the universe to calculate all those things in the first place. And when people talk about moving the universe and stuff like that, they're not paying attention to the way mass operates. It's being influenced by all the momentum of all the other pieces on each other. That's how things get moved around. So there's no way that there's something outside the universe that can come and influence the universe, right? So if there's an outside influence, we haven't gotten to the edge of the universe yet. That's basically what people should conclude about a lot of the observations that we have out space. But we won't talk about astronomy right now, but I'm going to talk about one other thing. See, we look at something and we get really excited because it's so effective, like quantum mechanics. It's so effective in being able to predict large amounts of changes on a very small scale that really don't have any randomness to it. People talk about it as being random, but those follow strict rules and therefore you can make a prediction of the overall outcome, but you don't have any information about the individual actions. But because quantum mechanics has been so effective, and it has been, we overdo it. We apply it to places it doesn't belong. It reminds me of planets. You know, I mean, I'm sure the people were very excited when they figured out planets were wandering stars, and they had this unusual experience in the sky, and they thought, these are such cool things, I'll bet they're the ones that are in control of our fate. And that's where astrology comes from. Now, astrology hasn't held up very well over the last couple hundred years, but it's still extremely popular, and people still think these planets control our fate. And they think that they control your fate, even though the planets are wandering through stars and constellations that we now know those stars aren't anywhere near where they look like they are to us. So this has nothing to do with reality at all. It has only to do with our hope for control over what's going on and hope for control over our lives. Ironically, there are a lot of ironies in the way we think about life. I mean, it's just the way it is. But ironically, you know, if you had omniscience, as is predicted for God, so on and so forth, if you had omniscience so that you knew everything that was going to happen, you no longer would have free will. They're absolutely right about that. You know, if someone has omniscience, there's no free will. But there's no free will for the one who has omniscience either, because it's already all done. There's nothing to say to change about it, because he can't change what he knows is going to happen. That's not possible. And so you really don't want to have complete control over everything, because then you won't make any more decisions in life. And everybody likes to make decisions, likes to desire things, go after things. So this projection of is a projection of our insecurity about not being in control of things, which leads you to think that we probably do have free will and can't control things, right? As opposed to just the other way around. It seems like that kind of points as evidence in the direction that we actually do have free will. Just like whenever we raise an authority up and say, you're the one that's going to tell us what to do, and you're the one that's going to control everything, and then they start saying, this is naughty, this is nice, do what's nice, don't do what's naughty. What do most people do? They run out and do what's naughty, right? Why? Because they want to exercise their free will. It's not very intelligent of the authoritarian to do this. Unless what they're really doing is they're lying about it. I wrote a short story one time where I had Jehovah change his mind. He comes back and he outlaws kindness, he outlaws generosity, he outlaws all the things that make life really wonderful, because he thinks everyone will do exactly what they did last time and violate all those rules, and therefore he's going to get what he wants by telling them not to do it. So this idea that we have about controlling things is just our imagination trying to project onto the world what it is that we want out of it. So in determinism, we have a lot of that. It's really pretty ironic. You know, the physicists that are dead set on total determinism are a lot like the Calvinists, you know, who are also dead set on it. And the Calvinists, you know, Calvin's idea was that, you know, it's been determined from all time. God knew exactly what he was doing, and that's very logical if you're going to say that he's omniscient and omnipotent. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knows exactly what the future is, and we don't. And we don't really have any control over the situation. You're either the elect or the not elect. You know, and ironically, of course, most of the people believe they're one of the elect, of course, but then there's this one unfortunate thing which he said, which was there's not too many elect. So that everyone's kind of looking at each other and say, well, he thinks he's elect, but he's not. I know I'm elect, and he's not. And this gives people a lot of pleasure. And that's why it's appealing. But the fact is, you can't do anything about your situation. And the nice thing about that is, you know, you might get the reward or not, but you won't get the punishment, or at least you think you won't get the punishment, because you're not going to be held morally responsible for it. Now, it's ironic, because that's the whole argument about free will in the first place in that context, is that you have moral responsibility for it. So as you see, just the inconsistencies are not necessarily, they're not proof at all that it's not accurate theory, but it shows there's no reliable logic there. And if there's no reliable logic, you can be more comfortable thinking maybe they didn't know what they were doing, when they came up with that idea. So, but it's ironic, as I said, that the physicists are in the same situation because, in a way, they're kind of very proud that they can face the tough reality that we have no free will, right? And that sounds like Calvin, And I think their whole reaction about determinism, not their whole reaction, but a big part of their reaction about determinism and why it's popular is because that way they're not morally responsible for their actions in saying there's no God and that the universe is a machine. And so it's appealing. It's appealing in exactly the same way that determinism is in the religious context. And so they really didn't fall that far from the tree that they thought they were falling from. So we're in this situation of trying to figure out what's going on in the universe. And we are here making our decisions, our conclusions about it. And the interesting part of it for making those decisions is that we do seem to make decisions all the time about what we're up to. Now, we are, of course, completely hemmed in by our culture and other people telling us what they want us to do. We're hemmed in by the fact that we're in these bodies. But another thing in the, especially in the biological elements about determinism that come up, is you have this idea that the brain, for example, is responsible, going back to the experiment, the Libet experiments from 1983, that the brain waves are responsible for seeing what happens everywhere in the body, right? And that we can determine if the brain waves come first before the decision, then the brain waves control the decision rather than the other way around. But that's based on an assumption that we don't know whether it's true or not, which is that the brain and the electrical activities in the brain is the source of the issue, right? And so we look there and we make that choice, and we've been thinking that the brain is that for a long time now. And so we're pretty confident that that's the source of our thoughts, et cetera. But there's a lot of other possibilities. It could be that the heart is where the first part of that decision is made. People used to believe that. They used to believe that the heart made these decisions. The heart has reasons that the mind cannot know, this whole idea. And I'm not saying that that's true, but, has anybody studied that and seen what electrical activity there was in the heart at the same time? And did that decision precede, did something in the heart precede what was going on in the brain that then caused the person to, et cetera, et cetera? Now, and that's one possibility. There's another possibility. Scientists, of course, don't like the idea that the mind is not physical, that there are minds that aren't physical. I don't like that idea either. But I don't think that rules out the fact that the mind could be something that's physical but not biological. We know lots of things that spew atoms and that the atoms spew photons out. And if you just have half a belief of any of the experiences from near-death experiences to other things, almost everybody talks about beings of light. Now, so a being of light, it's immaterial, it's not physical, it's in a different universe, there's no time, there's no, all those things are just our guesses. What about the fact that we see light? Well, if it's light, it's physical. What if our minds are made out of light, and that's what they are? They're not biological, but they're still physical, and they still operate according to physical rules. So we know from experiments that light photons are used to send electrical signals down our nerves. So if our minds are light, they could send photons out that hit our nerves and make our bodies move. Now, we know that we're making our bodies move some way or another. We just don't know how. Now, if that were true, and there's no way probably to prove that either. Proof, as I said, it doesn't exist. But it seems at least one of the other possible things, so that when you say, how convinced are you of this theory? You say, well, if that assumption is correct, that the brain waves are the thing that's responsible and that's what causes everything, then I'm willing to listen to your argument. But there's probably all kinds of other possibilities that people don't think about. The same thing is true for the initial conditions argument in physics. we make the assumption, even from initial conditions, just like Aristotle, that there's some first cause. And that first cause causes the initial conditions. Something has to be. The scientists aren't comfortable with the idea that it comes out of nothing, but they don't have an argument yet. There is a growing group of scientists that say the universe might actually be eternal, that is, it's uncreated. Now, that's an interesting idea because it matches the laws of thermodynamics and the fact that mass energy is conserved at all times. Because that would mean there's no creation and no destruction, there's just reorganization. And if that's true, it's a little bit like, you could imagine the universe a little bit like Legos, right? There's decillions of Legos, these little pieces. And there's decillions of Lego characters that are running around putting those little Legos together however they want to. And then other characters coming around and pulling them apart, if they play the way children do. So, if we look at the world, we know that according to the rules and the initial conditions and physics all by itself, that if you have initial conditions and everything comes down from there and it follows these rules, that it's all moving towards entropy, right? Less work can be done, less work can be done, less can be done. But we have anti-entropic experiences every day because our lives are anti-entropic. You cannot have everything moving downhill to create life. Something has to move against the entropy, at least in a localized way, in order to create the anti-entropic experience of life. Now, that doesn't mean that the Earth isn't going to be dissolved by the sun blowing up in 4 billion years, but we have a pretty big window here in which to play with our Legos on this planet, and rearrange things the way we want to. And it seems to me that indicates that the conclusion about life is possible, not proven or anything like that, but there's another alternative, which is that it's not an autocracy, it's not an oligarchy, it's not even an accident of chance, it's a democracy. And the democracy is, we get decillions of minds and decillions of little Legos, and we're always putting them together in the places where that works in order to try to live life the way we want to live life. And we're, of course, hemmed in by other people and what they decide and rules about matter and everything like that. But that's another possibility. And as I said, no proof of it, but there's no argument that says that couldn't be. And if you look at, don't use that joke. So if you just look at the world and say, what are the possible experiences? Well, let me throw in some experiences that we all have that make it clear that the mind could actually be this sort of light, addicted being, you might put it that way, likes to play with light all the time, because that's what our dreams are. We shut off the world and we create these worlds in this light inside of our own heads, and we make all kinds of things happen. And our body even reacts to some of it because, it kicks if we're falling off of a cliff, that kind of thing. So our body is even semi-attached to our productions in our mind, but we're not attached to the reality. We're not reacting to the reality outside. We're reacting to the reality inside in our own minds. And since we can make those motions happen in our bodies from our dreams that are just made of light, then why can't we, that could be what we're doing every day when we're awake. That we're having thoughts, and our thoughts, which we don't see, they could be made of light or some kind of energy of some kind that then stimulates our nerves to make ourselves react. Now, another element to go back to the experiment, the Libet experiment about, do we have free will because these things happen, is it ignores another big part of our whole experience, which is, sports, muscle memory, ping pong, even in ping pong, so they're not just the great football players and stuff. They learn what they're doing so well that they see a ball leave the quarterback's hand and they can kind of tell where it's going to be 50 yards later because they've done it so many times. And they've done all those calculations. They didn't do them on a computer or anything. They did it in their head from their past experience. And they not aware of those calculations. They're only aware that their hand goes up at the right time. Now, the demonstration for free will there is, in addition to the fact that we think they're making decisions anyway when they do this, is if they're being paid by some gamblers to blow the game, their habit may be to reach up and grab the ball, and their hand goes up, and then, oh, I missed it, because they veto what their habit is. They veto their habit. Now, I use that example rather than other habits which we veto all the time, or forget to veto when we should. but that's another example of we have these habits, our bodies are used to it, our minds are making decisions, and we're not fully aware, as that one chart showed, we're not fully aware of what's going on inside of our head. But that does not mean that we're not making decisions. And somewhere in the process, especially if the mind is, a being of light, that's not going to be measured by anybody until they figure out how to measure that. And so you won't know that. Now, a good analogy is, for where we are in trying to figure this out, is if you were looking at a car engine, and the car engine is running, and you had it hooked up, and you figured out that the carburetor makes the car move forward, and the brake pads deters the motion. Now, there's always a bias when you're measuring something that you assume the source is what you're measuring. So you got that. Now, what if you think, but maybe it's the right foot on that right pedal and the right foot on the left, on the other pedal, that causes the increase. So you measure, you tie all that up, and then you say, okay, that's actually the source. That comes before the carburetor. If that doesn't happen, the carburetor doesn't open up. If that doesn't happen, the brake pads don't do it. And then you move backwards into the brain of the person and say, was it the brain that made the foot move? And then, yeah, it looks like that's the brain that made the foot move. And then you have a psychologist come in and say, when his mother was pregnant with him, she ate too much ice cream, and that slowed down the process in his brain, and that's why he's not good at pushing the pedal to the metal. And then you could have someone say, well, yeah, but it's actually the initial conditions of the universe that set up this decision process, and you can always push it back. Or you could say, it's just the sense perceptions we have as we're driving down the road that we're reacting to that makes us decide, I'm going to push on the gas, I'm going to push on the brake. That's what we decide. That's how we experience life. So my point is not that none of those other theories are correct. They could be correct. But the common sense one that we experience every day is just as reasonable, if not more reasonable, than those other ones, that we do make those decisions, and that the initial conditions of the universe didn't care anything about them. Right? And the other part to the whole initial conditions argument that's not taken into account, as I mentioned briefly, is that it implies that there are no other causes other than the first cause. But if our minds are making sure that entropy doesn't take over the whole universe by having our little elements of anti-entropy everywhere, then there are other causes, our minds. And our minds making those other causes are going to make it so that the universe is not determined. That what we do, what we decide, will create the future. So the past is finished. It's done. How the Legos all were lined up in the past is done. But whether you're going to take that one off and put it over here and this one over here and so on and so forth, and whether you're going to have a fight with the other Lego character over here, or whether you're going to work together with them to make it even bigger, all those things are still to be done. And it's still for us to decide, what are we going to do about this? So it seems to me that the idea is appealing emotionally, determinism, but without good reason, because we don't like uncertainty, right? And as soon as we accept the fact that we have free will and that we're either going to fight or not fight with people, work together with them, we have uncertainty in our lives. And we don't like that. So we come up with ideas that tell us there's no actual, it looks like there's uncertainty, but there's actually no uncertainty at all. It's all taken care of. Don't worry about it. And that's why we find that appealing. But the fact is, it looks like we have to live with uncertainty. And it's really not as hard as it seems. And even, like Richard Feynman, the physicist, said that, Uncertainty, once you know it's there, it's easier to deal with and live with than being certain about what you don't really know. And the uncertain, I mean, if you have certainty, you have no choice. And you have no freedom, and you can't get what you want. Another thing that's really interesting to me, and why I find the whole subject very interesting, is because I focus a lot on personality theory and why we do what we do. And for me, happiness is the emotion caused by the fulfillment of a desire. So if we don't have any real desires, that's all out. That whole pattern doesn't make any sense at all. But in addition to that, one of the things that I noticed in this theory of why the relationship between our happiness and our desires and the quality of our happiness and the quality of our desires, the reason that relationship was not seen was because there was a mad actor in there. The mad actor, mad actor, is obedience. We think obedience is actually a virtue, but actually it gets in our way. Because when obedience is our motive, then the real desire is to obey some other mind and not to be free. And as I said, we really are all 2-year-olds. We really would rather say no to just about everybody and do what we want to, right? So it dampens us down. It's not as much fun. A good example is, a lot of people are in med school. Some are there because they really want to be doctors. Some are there because they half want to be doctors and their parents are paying for it. Some people are there because their parents said, if you don't do that, you'll never see another cent from us for the rest of your life. And so each of these motives that people have for being there makes a big difference in how much they enjoy med school, how much they enjoy their careers, all that. Because the more obedience there is in your motive, the less fun you have. So if we eventually believe that the universe is determined and therefore obedience is all there really is, that just means we're not going to have any fun at all. And so, even if it is true, we should pretend it isn't. We should say no. No, we do say no, but we could keep saying no because we really don't, and the reason I make that as a joke, but the fact is none of those theories are persuasive enough. Their logic isn't persuasive enough. Their input is not persuasive enough that you really don't need to accept them and say, oh, I just don't understand it. No, they don't understand it. And they admit that they don't understand quantum mechanics, for example. Quantum mechanics is so effective at doing things, at creating the end result of a large number of outcomes. But it's no good at predicting who's going to win a horse race, and a particular horse race. It can say over time, these are the odds. Gambling's all the odds, and et cetera, et cetera. This is a 100 to 1 odd. But every once in a while, the 100 to 1 odd wins, most likely in movies. but it does win sometimes. And there are a lot of minds involved, the jockey's mind and the horse's mind, in deciding who's going to win a race. And so it's not completely predictable. That doesn't mean that we can't say things like, 50% of all children are going to be born out of wedlock next year, because last year it was 49% or something like that, and this is the trend. But when that prediction is made, something might change. The whole society may say, oh, no, we're all going to go back to marriage, and we're not going to get divorced anymore, and we're going to have 12 kids each. That could, it's happened before. It can happen again. And so all the trend curves and everything will be wrong at that point, because people will change their minds about something for whatever reason. And the reason is because, in politics, we have chaos that we're trying to avoid and total authoritarianism, which we also don't like. And we want to be somewhere in the middle there, right? And so the only thing worse than authoritarianism is that total chaos. And so if you were in a society that was in chaos, like, say, El Salvador was for many, many years, in the 1980s they had an election, and the United States was really happy about trying to get them to have a nice liberal democracy there. And over 85% voted for a strongman general to take over. And everyone's going, hey, what's going on? That's not what we asked for. We asked you to have a democratic election. But the people were so close to chaos for so long, that's what they wanted. That's what they wanted. After another 30 years of that, they didn't want that anymore. They start to move in another direction. So the sweet spot's in the middle between those positions. And in the United States, we kind of try to move it towards the more freedom, more freedom. But the reason that that works in America, or has worked until recently, the reason that works in America is because a large number of people in America are accustomed to this idea and have been for quite a while. And and even the original people that came here were third and fourth sons of families that were tired of being dominated by their fathers and their older brothers. And so they were rebels already. And look at the people who came to California. They weren't just rebels, they were chaos. You know, that was about pretty close to chaos that came here. And we still have, you know, some influence of that on Silicon Valley. So and that helps us be very creative. But it also is a choice. And a lot of countries and cultures do not make that choice. And trying to make them change their choice, that's a fool's game. It's not going to happen. So all I'm really saying about this free will determinism argument is that our personalities reveal that we make free choices all the time. And our personalities and our daily lives, if we're just practical about it, common sense about it, makes it clear that we make those choices, and that ants make those choices too, and that everybody in between is making those choices too. And it doesn't mean when you're making choices that you're making smart choices. You know, you're just making choices. A lot of them are extremely foolish. But it's better, you know, as Gandhi said about India, you know, it's better for India to be badly run by Indians than well run by the British. That was one of the arguments used to the British. Now, he wouldn't have made that argument to the Indians. He was so clever about how he undid the British culture in terms of, you know, what would make them step down. Okay? He was a well-trained lawyer. So that was a total aside. I don't know why that came up. But he made a choice. Well, he made a choice. He made a choice. How am I going to try to persuade the British to do what I want them to do? And use good arguments. It doesn't mean that they were proven arguments. They were effective on their personalities. He got them when they were down after World War II, too. That was really helpful. So if we look at that, our world that way, and we say that we're in the universe, and we are small beings in this huge universe, and we're in here in the same game room with all kinds of other children, and we're trying to get our way. But if we get real smart with some of our cultures, we figure out that we get more happiness by cooperating with other people than we do by fighting them the whole time. And we've learned that, you know, some of us. And we can learn other things. There could be a tremendous amount of things that we can learn about this. But in any case, we are in this world making decisions, and we can either that's true or we can pretend it's true, and we will have more enjoyable lives. Not perfectly happy, because perfect happiness is you get everything you want, right? Everything that you want, you get. And that's why we imagine perfect happiness that way. But that's a real mistake on our part, because that would mean to get everything we want, that everything was determined, and we would have actually no choices at all. So we go overboard, like we do with anything that's good. We go overboard and push it too far. It's like going for perfection or going for excellence. If you go for excellence, you can be pretty happy. If you go for perfection, you're almost always miserable, because you're never perfect. And there is no such thing. And perfection is a static state. See, people, you know, I'll go back to the theological argument for just a second. The theological argument for determinism is that God is omniscient. Now, is that a reasonable assumption to make? That there is any such thing as omniscience? Knowledge is not a Lego. It's not quantized. Knowledge is a process that's always changing. And so you can't have all the knowledge Legos in the universe in your pile, because they're not quantized. You can't know, for example, what it's like to know English and to not know English at the same time. And God can't know, no mind can know, what it's like to be you at the same time as he's him. Now, he might be able to completely read Milt's mind. So, and he knows exactly what's going on in Milt's head. But he still doesn't know what it's like to be Milt without being God. See? So there's a limitation. And those limitations are just in the nature of knowledge. It's not quantizable. And therefore, this assumption about omniscience is inaccurate. Now, that may cause some problems someplace, but if it's not accurate, you can rely on the logic there, just like square circle, to say that's not likely. Now, maybe it's true. Maybe there's some inadequacy of that argument, or maybe there's another way to look at it. But for all practical purposes, you can say that's probably not true, and I'm going to act as if it's not true. And so the same thing is true about determinism. It's highly unlikely that determinism, based on just all the false assumptions we have. But we also are basing those assumptions and our other assumptions on assumptions we have about how the universe operates. And I don't think it's a fair assumption to say we already know everything about physics. We learned a whole lot, but we don't know everything about it. Just like, if you just go to biology, we know about the human body. We've got maybe 10,000 times more knowledge than we had 100 years ago, or even more. But we're probably still 3% knowledge about what's going on inside of us, something like that. So we should be a little bit, cautious about thinking we're done. But I'm done. All right, we have a couple of questions from the online audience. What is the role of our ego in the discussion of free will? Okay. There are, like Buddhists and Hindus and many other people feel that you have to get rid of your ego in order to merge with the divine reality. And I'm just going to say it straight out. I think this is a mistake, and I don't think anybody ever does it. It's like saying you have to get rid of all desire in order to reach nirvana. Okay? Is the desire for nirvana a desire? Sounds like one to me. And therefore, if you become a one-track desire, you might get there. But it's true that if you're there, and this is written by the yogis and the Buddhist monks and everything, you've gotten to enlightenment, and then you begin to think right away about what else not right away, but maybe a couple months later you start thinking, okay, now what else am I going to do? So you already have other desires. And it's even interesting, the whole idea of bodhisattvas is that they get almost to nirvana, and then they decide it's more fun to help you get there too than to actually get there themselves. That is what now, that idea makes no sense whatsoever, but it's extremely emotionally appealing to the believers because that makes you the center of the universe and more important than nirvana to the bodhisattva. You can't escape those emotional values. It's very, very hard to not be seduced by that kind of an argument, which is why Buddhism was very unpopular for the first 300 years. And when the monk that decided upon bodhisattvas brought that out, he made that a very popular religion, even though they say it's not a religion, and it kind of isn't. So the role of our ego in this discussion of free will is that I think the decider, the person who decides, what decides all your decisions, that's your ego. And you can call it whatever you want to, but obviously it's there, it exists, and no matter what you do with it, that's what it is. Now, is it good to be egotistical? No. It's not good in your own pursuit of your own happiness. That's a whole other argument. I can say one big thing, unselfishness is probably the most intelligent form of selfishness there is. You're going to get more pleasure out of that than you're going to get out of any other form of selfishness. So it's in your self-interest to be unselfish. And I won't spend a lot more time on that tonight. But I've talked at length about that before, and I think most people feel that way. People on their dying beds, they think about the kindnesses they did or that other people did to them. That's much more common than all kinds of other things in life, because those are the parts where we really feel connected in a world where we're not, where we can easily feel unconnected, because we are individuals. We talk about marriages as egos merging and minds merging and becoming one, and we want to become one with the universe. But if everybody, and there's even people in Silicon Valley who want to become one with a computer, along with all the people that they work with that they can't stand, who also their minds are going to become one with the same computer. I really don't understand why that's an ideal. But in any case, that whole desire for oneness is also to escape the responsibility for making your individual decisions, which seems it's such a hard thing to bear for us, but actually, we're going to do it anyway. We are going to make our own decisions anyway. And it's not that hard. And the better you get at making decisions, the more confident you obviously become. But the more you stop thinking that it's such a pain in the neck, you say, hey, that's a pretty good game actually here, to make your own decisions and to make them intelligently. And I think when you pick up on how unselfishness is actually a good idea, that becomes a lot clearer. And let's see. So most people seem to be often controlled by primal emotions, often rationalized. Can we say that they still have free will while being emotion-driven? Yes, but their freedom is constrained. As I said before, you're hemmed in by society, you're hemmed in by your own emotions, your own habits. Your personality and your attitudes are your conclusions about life in reality. Not your religious beliefs are just stated intellectually. Whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, whether you believe in being selfish or unselfish, whether you like to be cruel, or whether you have nothing to do with cruelty. If you think, it's very interesting to watch people react to displays of cruelty in public, which I won't mention. But half the people think that was a really good idea. And half the people say, that was absolutely awful. And that has a lot to do with whether you think cruelty is the way to deal with other people, whether being a bully is the way to deal with other people, that's what protects you, is being a bully. But being a bully just makes it very clear how weak and insecure you are. So if you want to lay yourself out for other people to manipulate you, just ask in any law firm. You want to make yourself manipulatable, you try to be a bully, and your bosses are going to manipulate you to their own ends. And it's not just in law firms. It happens in kindergarten classes, right? So those are the questions that came in online. If anybody has any questions.
The idea of decision-making, it seems very big to me because we make a decision. I feel like we make decisions in the same way that you were describing the ants. Like every second of every day, we're making a decision. So is there some way to maybe, I'm trying to get a better definition or a better vision or a more clear vision of the decision, like what kinds of decisions are you talking about? Is it even minimum decisions, like what should I have for breakfast, or big decisions like who should I vote for, or, and I guess I'm not really pitching it against determinism, because I don't, right. I just want to understand, because I'm doing some studying now on rationality and how people make decisions. And so I'm trying to get a better feel for what an actual decision, like how are people conceiving the idea of making a decision?
Great question. So I mean all decisions, just like with the ants. And I do think we make thousands of decisions every day. And I think we're free to make them. But like the ants, we have habits. And we don't want to think through all of our decisions every day. So it's not like, oh, I have to decide which job to take. And then you do research and think it through and stuff like that. Most decisions don't take anything. A lot of people eat the same breakfast every day. They might be have a different lunch every once in a while, but the breakfast is the same every day because they don't want to make a decision that early in the morning about what they're going to eat, among other things. So a lot of decisions we put on automatic. That doesn't mean that we don't make the decision, because you can have the same breakfast every day for 30 years, and then one day you wake up and say, nah, after all, I'm going to have Cheerios because I didn't have them since I was a kid. And you go, and you were willing to go out to the store and get them and everything, all because you had this one idea, I want to do something different and I want to remember my childhood, something like that. So yeah, but I think every single decision that we make is what I'm talking about. Now, how does it influence the quality of our lives? Most of those decisions don't do almost anything. It's just our habit. So we're just swimming through life with those decisions. But there are big decisions that we make that make a big difference. Like you're 14 and you find out that adults have been lying to you. And then you have to figure out what you're going to do about that, right? Are you mad? Are you going to fight them? Are you going to say, let me look into this a little bit more? And that has a lot to do with the personality you already have, usually. You also still are influenced by the way you are, to how you deal with those situations. So it seems to me that at the high end of decision making is, what am I going to do about my personality? I have all these attitudes that I've developed. I have all these experiences that I developed. I read a novel where I kind of really liked a character that did things quite differently than I did. Should I try to be more like that person? But there are very few people like that. I'm reading The Idiot by Dostoevsky right now, so that's why I bring that up. He's a guy that doesn't behave the way other people do at all. So it's something that you can change, but it does not change quickly. It's a big decision, but I do think that having more knowledge, or you come to new conclusions, and a lot of people would, before making a decision like that, want to have perfect knowledge to make that decision, right? And that's why they want certainty, which is why they want all that to be, and you just have to accept the fact that the next decision you make, you may have to fix again later, but that's all right. That you still are going to be moving, and even if you zigzag on your movements, you go even one step forward, 2 steps back, that's better than standing still the whole time and not ever making any decision about where you want to go with your personality. Because just the habit of saying I can make decisions about where I'm going to take my personality is an important change. Just like, when you look at big cultures, you say, where did that come from? And, I'll give you an accident version once. Japanese culture adopted in the 7th century, adopted Buddhism. And it was very popular, and the emperor was very effective for about 200 years. So they had a very stable society at the beginning of Buddhism. And then the warlords figured out that the whole thing was weak, and they took it over. But during that time, they developed this minimalist art, this love of this refined beauty, calligraphy, other things. So then the warlords, for the next 500 years, in order to be shogun, or to be someone who was important in Japanese society, had to learn all of those things. We don't have generals that learn calligraphy. That's just a part of their culture, because you are a responsible, important person in that culture, only if you learn these things. Now, it's faded away a little bit, but you can see it at Cherry Blossom time still. It's affected the entire culture as something, a sort of ephemeral sense of beauty, right? Okay, so something simpler. In America, we got the idea that our children should do better than we do. A lot of cultures, the children are supposed to keep their heads down and not do anything that embarrasses their parents as being smarter, better, understand something better than their parents. But widespread, not completely, but widespread in America is the opposite idea, that children are supposed to outdo us, and therefore we can be proud of them when they do that kind of thing. Well, if you don't think that one idea is responsible for at least 1/3 of America's energy, I think that's a big part of our energy as to where we outdo other places. Now, there are other ways of being very energetic in this way, and the Chinese are moving along with their own method of doing that as well. But so it's not like there's only one cause of these things. But those are big ideas, and they change our personalities, they change our culture when enough people do it. And so those big ideas are almost always, you have to think it through. I mean, that's what philosophy was supposed to be for. A lot of time is spent arguing about things because they're there to be argued about, and you can, there's another department that has the other idea, and so you can argue our department's better than that department and stuff like that. It's good practice for being a good arguer, but it doesn't get to the heart of what philosophy was for, at least for the ancient Greeks, which was to try to figure out what the heck's going on here, and can we figure out anything that will help us make decisions that will make us live higher quality lives, and you see it right away there, after Plato, with this broad thing, then Aristotle focused on the material world and used his things there. And then the Stoics and the Epicureans split off. One, talked about how you have to kind of grin and bear it, with the tough things in life. And the Epicureans didn't have what we eventually called Epicureanism. They said that pleasure is the thing in life, but they had very sedate pleasures. It wasn't the way it looked a couple hundred years later. So it split off, and then because it focused on pleasure, that went in one direction, that went in another direction. They all split off of Plato's big theory, but they all took pieces of it.
Strange question. How would I explain this to my 8-year-old daughter, that what you are explaining here? I feel like I need to practice it myself to understand it better and apply it, but how would I help my daughter to understand it earlier while she's making her first steps in life? Thank you.
Great. Sophie, you want to answer that one? My daughter's here. She's no longer 8. She was subjected to this.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, how do I explain this to my 8-year-old daughter? This idea. So I would say, the first of all is when they're 2 years old and they say no, that you don't get mad at them. That you encourage them to say no and to do what you want. And you say, well, why? They always ask the question, why to you? You ask the question, why, back to them. Get them going on the same subject. Turn them into philosophers. Why? Why are you saying no? Do you think it's not good for you? Or are you tired? Or so I would start first in saying, part of the whole theory of downing your ego is because parents really want the children's egos to be downed while they're raising them, because it makes it a lot easier, right? And so this is just a projection of that same thing into religion. And so I think if you can resist that to whatever degree you can resist, that's useful to the child. You say, this is an ego. There's all kinds of theories of childhood and what parenting is like. But if you think, okay, this is a friend, and my idea about parenting is, what can I do about observing them and seeing what their personality is like, and then tell them things that will make them as happy as possible. Not perfect, not upset when they're upset, and stuff like that. And say, and accept their way of looking at life, because that's what they're going to live with their whole life anyway. And then give them opportunities to think slightly differently. If they say, well, I see you're looking at it this way. Have you ever looked at it this way? And if you happen to know books that have those ideas, then you don't even have to be the bad guy by telling them that. You just let them read the book, and then they get the idea. Or they don't get the idea. So at an 8-year-old, I just say, the main thing that I would talk about, not the free will versus determinism, but how does your personality operate? You desire things in order to be happy. And you try to make those desires come true so that you can be happy. Because if they don't come true, you're unhappy. That's the thing. It's a game. If there was no failure to it, then it probably wouldn't. There's 2 different emotions. If you fail, you get one thing, and if you succeed, you get another. So you can say that in that pursuit of happiness, you've made up the desires, and you have habits about what makes you happy. And you'll see that as an adult, or the adults around you, don't have the same desires as children do, because everyone changes as they grow older as to what's fun for them. There's a great story about Mark Twain's daughter, which I'll end with to make this point. His daughter was crying. She was about 6, 7, 8 years old. And he said, what's wrong, Susie? And she said, my doll's, leg is broken. And he said to her, oh, that's a small thing, don't worry about it. And she just stopped, and she sat there for a while, and she looked up at him and she said, Daddy, what's a small thing? To her, it was a big thing. And it's important because you say, what's a small thing? It's all perspective of the child. And this is a really good example about happiness. You see, you're a 6-year-old girl and you have a brother, and the brother comes in and rips the head off your doll, right? So you're mad at your brother, right? And you have a certain amount of pain and suffering. And then time goes on, you're around 10 years old, and your brother comes in and rips off the head of the doll, and you don't care anymore because he's done it so many times, and it really doesn't bother you anymore. And then you're 19 or 18, you're going off to college, and you box up all the dolls, and you say, well, that brother was obnoxious, and then you put all the dolls away. And then you're 25, 30 years old, you have a daughter of your own, 35, she's 6 or 7 years old, and she has a brother who pulls the head off of her doll. And she starts crying, and you, as a 35-year-old, are looking at that, and you have pain, again, for your daughter being in that situation. It's all the same thing. But every single experience is different emotionally, quality-wise. It all has to do with what are your desires, what are your attitudes towards the experience. And that, people say, to go back to the question from the online person, said, how can we control or how can we influence these deep emotional desires that move us? I mean, the deep emotional habits that move us. We cannot change our emotions directly. You cannot change them directly. But you can change your ideas and your desires, because that you can do intellectually. And when you do that, you change your emotions. Now, we do this all the time with all those thousands of decisions every day, but this can be done intentionally. And you can do it by saying, what does it seems to work for other people and what doesn't, and make an exam, an approach to life that way too. And your emotions will change. You can, for example, I guess I wasn't going to stop. When it comes to democracy, do we really believe in democracy? No? Okay. So, how many people watching what's been going on for the last month said, I'm really happy because the guy I voted for is doing a fantastic job doing exactly what he said he was going to do? Okay? That's one group of people, right? And then another group of people say, I knew he was going to be like that. I can't stand the fact that he's going to be like that, and I'm really upset. And then there's another group who said, well, not what I wanted. The majority wanted it. That's democracy, so I'm happy that democracy has won. Okay? So if we really believed in democracy, that's how we would feel emotionally, which shows you that almost none of us believe in democracy. We are all authoritarians in our mind, which is why we project it out on the world, which is why we believe in determinism when it doesn't exist. And that's where I will end. Thank you very much.